The first 5 rules that we covered were all related to harmony. In other words, maintaining the unity of the composition at the paragraph and sentence levels. The next 5 rules deal with power, the second half of the effective academic writing equation. Express yourself in a manner that conveys the most possible force and energy. The first rule I'd like to explain under the category of power is the use of the active voice mostly. While this course is not technically a grammar course, we can't talk about powerful writing without talking about grammar, and in particular, the concept of voice. You see, verbs are either transitive, requiring a direct object, or intransitive, not requiring a direct object. A transitive verb would be the verb to kick, for example. So we could say John kicked the ball. The object is the ball, and of course the transitive verb is kicked. An intransitive verb is to sleep. For example, John slept late last night. Rule 6 is related to transitive verbs because only these verbs have an active and passive voice. The active voice follows the pattern of agent, John, plus verb, kicked, plus receiver, the ball. Now that you know what the active voice is and you know how to form it, let's look at the passive voice. When the subject of a transitive verb is the receiver, for example, the ball, rather than the agent, John, the verb is said to be in the passive voice. For example, we could say, the ball was kicked by John. The agent may be mentioned as part of a by phrase after the verb, but it's not necessary. We form the passive voice verb by adding the verb to be to the past participle verb. Okay, so we know what the active voice and passive voice are. Now the question is, why should the active voice be used most of the time? Put simply, the active voice is more direct, concise, and vigorous than the passive voice. Rudolf Flesch said, a sentence that is cast in the active voice hits the mind of the reader and makes him sit up and take notice. A passive voice sentence passes through his mind without much trace. The passive voice uses to be, which lacks meaning, making your writing dull. Okay, that's enough theory. Let's look at some examples. I'll first read the indirect or passive voice and then contrast that with the more potent active voice. Related to the passive voice are indirect expressions such as there plus to be or it plus to be. I'll discuss this in more detail under Rule 8. In all of these examples, you'll notice that the passive or indirect sentences are longer than the active voice sentences. That means you're using more words to say what could be said in fewer words. And this is always to be avoided in academic writing, where you want to be direct and to the point. So let's look at the first example. My first visit to Paris will always be remembered by me. Compare that with the active voice. I will always remember my first visit to Paris. There were a lot of dead fish lying on the beach. A lot of dead fish covered the beach. The sound of a phone vibrating somewhere in the house could be heard. Somewhere in the house, a phone buzzed. The reason why he left university was his health became impaired. Failing health caused him to leave university. It was not long before she was very apologetic for what she had said. She soon regretted her words. There are, of course, times when the passive voice should be used. That's why I said use the active voice mostly. Sometimes using the passive voice is warranted. For example, when we want to emphasize the receiver of the action rather than the doer. So there are exceptions to this rule like any rule. Okay, so in these examples, the passive voice would actually be the better way to express each sentence. The atrocities of Red October are rarely justified today. People today rarely justify the atrocities of Red October. Wheat is grown all across Canada. Farmers grow wheat all across Canada. Notice that in both of these examples, the use of the active voice doesn't really add any meaning, nor does the use of the passive take away any meaning. This is because the subject, in other words, people and farmers, are quite mundane and obvious. Moreover, our focus is on the atrocities of Red October in the first sentence and wheat in the second sentence. The Merchant of Venice is considered to be one of Shakespeare's greatest plays. Shakespearean scholars consider The Merchant of Venice to be one of Shakespeare's greatest plays. Civilization on Trial was written by Toynbee in 1948. Toynbee wrote Civilization on Trial in 1948. In the first example, the subject is again mundane and obvious. In other words, the addition of the agent doesn't add any real meaning. In the second example, the focus of the writing is on the book rather than the author. Related to this topic of passive voice and indirect expressions that undermine the power of your prose is the poor habit of nominalization. Too often, clumsy writers make the subject of the passive voice verb a noun that also expresses the entire action of the verb. Thus, the verb becomes meaningless. You see, the problem is that many students think nominalization is what makes writing sound academic, while undoubtedly many academics do overly nominalize in order to perhaps avoid making a direct and clear assertion. It definitely is not something to be encouraged. Let's look at some very difficult to read examples of nominalization to be avoided at all costs. So let's look at the first example. A survey of this land was made in 2016. This land was surveyed in 2016. Mobilization of the Navy was speedily effected. The Navy was speedily mobilized. Confirmation of these incidents of vandalism cannot be obtained. These incidents of vandalism cannot be confirmed. Notice that in each case of nominalization, a verb with relatively little meaning is included. For example, made in the first example, affected in the second, and obtained in the third. Although the examples to the right all employ the passive voice, this is fine because it's warranted based on what we said earlier about obvious and mundane subjects.